The second thing we define is cisgender. You spell it, and I explain what cisgender means. I was born male, I identify as a man, therefore I am a cisgender man. And it's one of those places where people who've never been able to have this conversation, because they don't know anybody they can have the conversation with, don't have to feel stupid, and they don't have to go through the trouble of trying to build a bridge to somebody that will give them permission to say, I really need to ask this question. Or they don't have to Google it. It's our responsibility to make it clear to them. It's also our responsibility not to presume that because LGBTQ issues are important that everyone's paying attention. That is not the job of a journalist. John Dewey once said, the media's job is to interest the public in the public interest. It is not your job to be interested. It is my job to be interesting. So if I can't make a story about the LGBTQ experience interesting, that is not your fault. That's my fault as a storyteller. And because we've been able to find ways to make all these stories interesting, we can talk about just about everything. We did a show very early on in our life as a talk show about PrEP, which a lot of people across the country either didn't know about or had stories to share about how hard it was to get in the parts of the country they were in, especially in the Southeast. We did an hour about a documentary called The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, who was one of the trans women who was right at the forefront of the movement that emerged after Stonewall. We did an hour called Ask a Drag Queen, which was one of the most fun shows I will ever do in my whole life. We did an hour about the lost art of cruising. Grindr, enough said. We did an hour just last month about where the fight for transgender rights stands now, just kind of like a broad-based check-in, and this is kind of what the show allows us to do. What we don't try to do is to tell positive stories, especially about LGBTQ people. I did a panel interview or a stage interview with Lena Waithe last year in San Francisco, and she was asked by someone in the audience, you know, I work with an organization that deals with disabled people, and we're trying to get the stories of disabled people told more broadly. How do we get more positive stories about disabled people in the public eye? And Lena Waithe said, I don't think you should want that. Because if you only tell stories that are positive, then they're inherently two-dimensional. A story requires conflict. If I don't know what you've overcome, I can't relate to you. And if there's no conflict, there is no story. Stonewall didn't happen because a bunch of gay men said, I'm a homosexual and I'm okay. That's not the way it worked. Stonewall happened because rent boys and leathermen and drag queens and people who couldn't go home punched police officers in the throat and hit them with bricks. That's the way the movement worked. It didn't start off as gay pride with a bunch of companies sponsoring floats. It was gay liberation. So the idea that the story of any community, especially the LGBTQ community, needs to be positive is anathema to everything we know as journalists and storytellers. We need to know what you struggled through. We need to know the good and the bad. We need to understand people who are succeeding and failing in the communities that we talk about. And even if the story is tragic, it can still be instructive. And unless you tell stories that are whole, you can't tell a three-dimensional story. And if you're not three-dimensional, you're not a person to me. You're just an idea. You're something I heard on the radio and not someone I met through the radio. So our job as a program is to be a place where the whole country can come together and talk about anything, can ask anything, can say anything. And we can be the moderator, we can be kind of the goalkeeper and the referee to make sure that people play fair. 1A is named after the First Amendment, which are kind of the basic rules of the road of how we interact with one another in a democracy. And right now, our democracy seems to have forgotten how to talk to itself. And I think for a lot of people, it feels like it's pulling apart at the seams. That is not my experience. I travel all over this country. I've done live events with big crowds like this and bigger on very tough issues, and not once has it gone sideways. Not once have we had people just lose their minds and start throwing chairs Jerry Springer style. Because what we tell the audience beforehand, and I'll finish with this, before we start taping, one of the things I tell the audience is we want to make sure that the American people hear everything you have to say. Please keep the energy either positive or neutral. If you hear something you like, feel free to applaud. If you hear something funny, feel free to laugh. But negative energy plays so badly on the radio that it turns people off. And if you turn our audience off, there is nothing we can do to bring them back. If you turn them away, it will be your fault, not ours. So no booing, no hissing, no heckling. Keep it positive or neutral. I have never once had an audience break that rule. Because at the end of the day, people want to be heard. And when they know that you respect them enough to actually listen and not malign what they have to say, they'll speak. And they'll speak freely. And they'll speak usefully. They'll tell a real story. They'll ask difficult questions. They will share things that would break your heart. And they will come together in ways that they never expected. And if there's anything that has to happen for communities to advance, to be acknowledged, to get the rights they deserve, to deal with societal issues, you have to know them. And our job is to make America know itself better. I can't think of a better job to do as a journalist than that.
Well, I'm Lou Chibarro, of course, and I'm filling in for Kevin Naff, my editor of the Washington Blade. As has been said, I've been a reporter for the Blade initially as a freelancer while working for other news organizations since 1976 on a part-time freelance basis. I didn't come on full-time with the Blade until 1984, or late 84, early 85. But what Joshua has just said is something that brings me back to when I first started in the 70s, and a little bit about what Michael was talking about, that things were quite a bit different then. And the fact that he and his program, your program, can talk about these LGBT issues in a way that is, telling the truth and bringing out the things that are really happening is not something I saw back in 1976 or earlier. I went to a graduate program at American University in a journalism program, and before I got my first news reporting job with energy and environment-oriented publications. That's what I was in before coming out and getting into the gay press business. But we talked about, some of us at the early years of the Blade, about how the mainstream so-called straight press de-gayed people. It was an issue that you saw where we knew some people to be gay. Sometimes they were famous people, sometimes they were local people who might have gotten into trouble or passed away for whatever reason. This is long before AIDS. And they would never report that part of them, that they were a member of the LGBT community back then, even some who were, in the words we use now, out. That, of course, has changed drastically, and it's very good to have witnessed that over the years. And I think this university played a small role, because I could recall one of my early stories was that the medical school here actually invited members of the gay community, then lesbians and gay men, to speak to medical school students and to show them, to talk about issues that they felt might be unique for the health and medical treatment of LGBT people back then. And I thought one of the more interesting things is this medical school professor, his name was Dr. Benny Waxman, who sadly passed away at a much younger than he should have, but he was showing gay porn films to the medical students in a large assembly in a room much larger than this, after which then the individual members of the gay community would be meeting these students and talking to them. And he said he did that because he felt future doctors should really know the mechanics of sex, just as they would for heterosexuals, but for homosexuals as well. And I think that set a precedent where I believe this university and hopefully others were progressive in the area of LGBT issues. What I've seen though is in terms of the health, as most people now know, we covered a few LGBT-oriented clinics. Whitman Walker, who I see Joe Izzo in the audience, has been involved with maybe as long as I've been with the Blade. But there was not AIDS, but there was VD, as it was called back then. And there was the Gay Men's VD Clinic that formed in the early years. And we did some early stories in the Blade about how sexually transmitted diseases might be more prevalent among gay men back in those days. When the AIDS epidemic hit, of course, it was something that hit us all. It was something that no one initially understood. I can recall that in the early 80s, it may have been 81 or 82, myself and Lisa Keene, the Blade's then news editor, traveled to New York to meet the activists, including Larry Kramer in those early years that they had just formed the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And we came back and started writing stories about what was going on in New York before it hit full force here in DC. And we became, at some point among some, including the gay businesses, we came under attack. They were saying, you're reporting stuff that's scaring people. It's harmful to business. What are you trying to do? We tried to explain as best we could, that we wanted to report what was going on in this oncoming epidemic. So I'm not going to go much more than that, other than to say that obviously things have changed drastically since that time. And it's good to see programs like WAMU doing the kind of programming you're doing. The Washington Post, who Kevin Naff, the Blade editor, used to joke almost as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, also often de-gayed people. And now we see them covering, LGBT issues quite aggressively and initiating stories that even we may not initially come by. So that's just a few examples of some of the things I've been doing over the years.
Wow, this is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to not being booed and hissed, by the way. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. And Esther, something you said actually just struck me as being very, very important. And first, thanks for the props to the program, but moreover, how you said it was community building and mental health. Trying to make an argument that building a community or doing things socially has something to do with improving the health of our community, and it really, really does. A really good example of this, there's a wonderful photo exhibit right in the other room. Our photographer is right here. This is a part of you can say hi. What I see in those photos is just this really fun, tight community that has a voice. They have community, they have people to be with, they have a sense of who they are. And that's so vital in terms of not only mental health, but physical health. We know that one's mental health has a direct impact on the physical health. So when we go and talk about the impact of our program, all of our students do capstone projects, and some of them are very, you can quantify, you do an intervention, you do pre-post tests, you do a training, you can document. But things like what Andrew is doing, and this is part of his capstone project, is doing something to give voice that just wasn't there before. And that I think is really critically important. And thank you, Esther, for making me think that, because that's the most beautiful way to articulate it. And I wanted to start, actually, Charles, to ask you about, because I had always wondered about this. I was way too young to understand this, but right after Stonewall, it seemed like there was this direct line, from Stonewall to the very early protests in the APA, or actually both APAs, and the effort that eventually in '73 had some success. And that's another example of community. Stonewall gave us some community in the mental health field. Can you talk a little bit about how that process was and where it started and how you got to where you were?
How Stonewall influenced the mental health community?
Yeah, and got DSM to take
No, it has nothing to do with it.
Tell us about it anyway.
Stonewall, let me give you my view of Stonewall. It's a little bit different than others. The issue is how did that happen? Because if you go back then, if you were gay, you were subject to arrest. You were considered immoral by the church. Parents would often throw their kids out of the house, and I have a couple of friends who were thrown out of the house when they came out to their parents and they were teenagers. It was a dreadful time. So how does Stonewall happen? My own view is that it was because of the Vietnam War. I was one of the leaders of the student strike in New Jersey, where I was doing my PhD, against the Vietnam War. And we happen to believe, rightly or wrongly, that we brought down the president because of our activism. The point is that the leaders of the movement that came after the Stonewall were people who participated in the anti-war movement. Afterwards, you got the women's movement, then the black movement, and third, the gay movement. And all the leaders there were activists in the Vietnam War, against the war. And so that we came out of that experience believing that if we were powerful enough to help end the war and cause the president to not run again for president, that was Johnson, that we could do anything. We were grandiose, and that's a good trait to have. Our attitude was, you can't fight City Hall, but you can piss on the steps. That's what we were doing. Out of that came, Esther was talking about GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, which self-destructed, and then the Gay Activist Alliance started after that, and that was more successful. But it was all political. The only real link is that some people who were involved in these organizations, mainly GAA, were graduate students in psychology, and I was one of them. And we just thought that maybe we could put our heads together and do something about it. But it really came from the activism. The real incident of greatest importance was a meeting of the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy. That was a group at the time that was had a positive view of using aversion therapy on gay people to cure them. I have to tell you this. They were talking about their cases, and one of the cases they had was a man who was gay, and they gave him electric shock. And what happened is that he became more involved in S&M. I thought they deserved that. But it was at one of those meetings that a political group, GAA, decided to demonstrate. And I led the demonstration against him. He was using electrical aversion. And it was out of that meeting that Bob Spitzer was in the audience, and he invited us to make a presentation. So it was because of the political action that we were able to get that on track.
Can I say something?
Absolutely.
I think I agree with you completely, and almost everyone I knew who was involved in GLF and then GAA had been an activist, anti-war activist. But I just want to make a point that I believe that virtually every social movement is founded on the abolitionist movement of the 19th century and then the civil rights struggle in the 50s. And I know people who became active in the movement who, you know, the gay movement, as it was then called, who had been on freedom rides and had done that kind of thing. But I think the most important thing that came out of that was the idea of an oppressed minority. And I think that was the key idea of the civil rights struggle. And really every movement that's come afterwards is modeled on that in many ways. In fact, the whole idea of I was born this way to justify why I'm gay or why I'm a lesbian, why I'm trans, any of those things, that I was born this way was to make it actually line up with the civil rights struggle and, you know, because, well, if you're born that way, you can't help it, was kind of, and that's still a very powerful idea in the LGBT movement. Anyway.
Definitely. Now, Michael, you, thinking back to the AIDS crisis and the response to AIDS, you were writing and publishing and editing all throughout that, and you edited, obviously, some very important people who had a lot to do with HIV/AIDS, including Larry Kramer and Randy Schultz. Most everyone is familiar with him, the band played on, but I don't know, can you talk a little bit about sort of like the community response and you know, how that was important to, and how perhaps literature and writing was important to, you know, sort of buoying the response to HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm proud of is that it was heavily the writers, the gay writers, who started emerging in the mid-70s. I mean, 1977 was a banner year in which Ed White's Nocturne for the King of Naples, Andrew Holland's Dancer from the Dance, Larry Kramer's Faggots, Paul Manette's, what was his first book? Anyway, his first book. And that's 10 years later. And Felice Picano. That was the first time. And that was a really big change. In 1972 or 73, Ed White had published his first novel called Forgetting Elena, which was an extremely modernistic study, well, maybe incomprehensible.
We'll settle for strange.
It was definitely strange. It was terribly lyrical. It was basically a novel about Fire Island Pines, not very thoroughly disguised, actually. And it got rave reviews. Nabokov, in a comment that just was repeated incessantly in publishing circles, has said it was the best American novel since Faulkner or something like that. Anyway, in 72, 73, he was the bright young man in fiction. And he wrote a second novel called Nocturnes from the King of Naples. And unlike the first, which was, as I say, very modernistic, sort of hard to understand, the second one, which is also lyrical, much more lyrical, was essentially about a love affair that had ended between two men. And it was essentially a lover talking to his dead boyfriend. And you would think that the fact that at least one of them was dead would have made it easy for the straight people to deal with. No publisher in New York City would take it. And this became a really big scandal because everybody knew that Ed was one of the best writers going, and everybody knew that all the major publishing houses had turned it down, only because of the subject matter. There's no graphic sex in the book whatsoever, you know? So that was the situation before 77. 77 was really a transformative year when those 5, 6, or 7 writers first published, or first published their openly gay material. And when AIDS started, basically in 79, 80, people were starting to get ill from the most peculiar things, and the most horrible things, actually. I mean, bird diseases that ate away at your brain and made you crazy. It was heavily the writers who responded first before almost any other group of people. I'm not sure about the medical people. That would be the only people that I think might have done it. But straight through the 80s, almost all the major American gay writers addressed the AIDS crisis. And this is completely unusual in the history of literature. I mean, if you look at writers, and especially if you look at great writers, they don't have a very good reputation in terms of politics. Most of them are conservative, if not totally reactionary, if not loony, for that matter. You know, most of your politically responsible writers tend to be not very good writers, you know, which has always been a bit embarrassing. You know, socialist realism of the USSR sort, you know, man meets tractor, man marries tractor. That type of thing. Anyway, I've written several times about this. I don't seem to have made an impression on people, or maybe I just haven't convinced them. I think this was a very unusual episode in the history of writing. There was virtually no parallel that I could think of. I mean, you might think at first that one of the most immediate parallels to come to mind would be the poetry that came out of World War I. But most of that poetry, some was written in the trenches, but not that much. Most of it was written after the war. Virtually all of it was published after the war and critically received after the war into the 20s, the early 30s. What happened with AIDS was the writers were writing, I mean, the parallel would have been as if the writers were writing in the trenches and distributing their writing to people also in the trenches. You know? That is almost unheard of. The only good example, or the only good parallel I could ever find for that was the Battle of Stalingrad, when Anna Akhmatova, the great Russian poet, took to the radio night after night, reading her great epic poem, while the city was being smashed to smithereens. I mean, Anna Akhmatova kept that city going for years, you know, as it was virtually destroyed. That was the only parallel I could find. I think that's quite remarkable. I'm very surprised that more literary historians or scholars have not taken that up, because I think a whole generation of gay writers actually became quite heroic at that time.
I've got one more question. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'd be curious to hear your reaction to a book, a novel that I thought was pretty seminal in the 70s, Patricia Nell Warren's Front Runner. Can you comment about that particular novel?
It was so strange that, the only gay novels that made it seemed to have been written by straight women. Because it turned out that Patricia was not a straight woman. And it also turned out that Memoirs of Hadrian was not a straight woman. But, at the time we all thought they were straight women. There's something odd that lesbians could write about gay male love affairs and be commercially successful, Although, Warren worked for the Reader's Digest for, 30 years, so she lived just outside New York City, and I knew her over the years. And for 20 years, there were attempts to make that movie, and it never got off the boards. But I thought that was a breath of fresh air. It was a book that I hung on to, and I think a whole lot of other people did too. It was very, very, very early.
Patricia High School.
True, but there's also gay as criminal.
Well,
Well,
Some
yeah,
of them are
gays
criminals.
were criminal. All right, well,
Since you mentioned Ed, Ed and I were co-authors, Ed White, we were co-authors of The Joy of Gay Sex. And the publishers were actually English, and they had published The Joy of Sex and made a bundle, so they thought they'd make a bundle talking about the joy of gay sex and the joy of lesbian sex. The two different books, of course. And the book was published in '77, and that was a year when there was a lot of censorship about books. And Ed and I, when we wrote it, we got enormous static from the publishers, things that they didn't want and things that they did want. They refused, they did not want anything about sexually transmitted diseases, although we insisted on that. But the story I want to tell, you seem to like funny stories, so let me tell you a funny story. I'm a New York, actually a Brooklyn Jew, with all the characteristics of that. Ed is a Midwestern wasp. And while we got along exceedingly well, we had different styles. And one day the English editor said, where can I go, where I can see homosexuals? So we thought it odd, since he was already in front of But Ed caught on immediately, and what he did is under the table, he grabbed my knee and squeezed it, because he knew that the next words out of my mouth would have been an attack. But he said, I have just the thing for you to do. There is a bar in New York that's called The Toilet. It was called The Toilet because it was. And he said, don't worry about the name.